Welcome to the Life Science Success Podcast. For those of you who are new here, my name is Don. I'm a consultant in the life science space. I help companies manage complexity and increase performance. Today, I'm going to be joined by April Zambelli-Weiner. And welcome, April.
Thank you, Don. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. So can you tell the listeners just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'll try to be short. I like to talk. You'll see that. So I am the founder and CEO of TTI Health Research and Economics, and we are a strategic market access consultancy and a contract research organization as well. Personally, I'm an epidemiologist by training. So my background is in epidemiological methods, clinical research, and genomics. And I have a really broad background in research, from bench research to field research to running a data analysis core facility at Hopkins. And so I left Hopkins, I left academia really looking to take that toolkit and apply it to a very wide range of problems in healthcare. I saw so much need, and I wanted to have a more diverse applied experience. I also was really frustrated with silos, data silos, but other silos, and the slow speed of translation. So my passion is really translational research, and that's why I love what I do, because part of what I do is say, how do we make research impactful and work for business outcomes and move the needle and actually get these programs and drugs and technologies to the patients who need them. So sort of in a nutshell, that's what we do. And we're very focused in the med tech life science space. We're also a federal contractor. We work for CDC and NIH, and we run big studies and things like that. But in terms of our commercial activity, it's really focused on helping to bring high impact emerging technologies to market.
Yeah, so that's a good transition to my first question. So how does your organization help companies through pre-market development through commercialization?
Sure. So, it usually, and well, I'll back up by saying I'm going to try to be really practical. I like to just be very practical with my insights and recommendations. So people come to us with a problem, and that problem can really vary because we work with companies across the life cycle. So at different phases, we do work with a lot of early stage companies, but the kinds of problems they might come to us for, maybe they're unsure about their optimal go-to-market strategy, or they need help getting investment. They're unsure how to drive reimbursement. They need to know how to generate evidence, but they don't know what or how. Sometimes it's even very more tactical and on the operations side, like they might just need data analytics support, but they need a more market-facing company. They want someone who understands how to translate research to the marketplace in a way that they need to receive it. So usually there's a point of entry that's a very specific need, but we almost always, because we're strategic consultancy, sort of ask, sure, if you want to buy a health economic model, we can do that model for you, and we can tell you what kind of model we think you need. But we really want to know what your business outcomes are that you're driving towards. And do you really know what your optimal path is? So that's the strategic part of what we do. So as you can imagine, services really range from go-to-market strategy, investor decks, full market access roadmaps, regulatory reimbursement landscape, evidence generation or EvGen. So building health economic models, designing and implementing clinical economic studies, value communication, dossiers, VAC packs, all those communication products. So it really does span the gamut. And a big portion of our work is programmatic. So where we're wrapping our arms around a company and we're taking them the whole way to whatever that may be, whether it's exit or, scaling or so on. Let me pause there.
So do you work with companies that are, it sounds to me like you work with companies that are extremely early stage to even somebody that's, getting ready to launch a drug as well.
Yes, we have a few select pharma clients. So there's a lot of companies that do what we do in the pharma space, and that's a more, I call it, commoditized marketplace, right? Because the market access pathway is a little more straightforward for a drug. So you've had all these, and then the regulatory pathway, you have all these CROs kind of crop up around that. But for anyone in the life sciences or med tech, we know that this pathway is entirely different and nuanced and difficult. And so that's really where our focus is. We do a lot of companion diagnostics and things. So we end up getting into that space sometimes that way as well. Um, but we do work with companies of all sizes. Of course, startups make up the majority of the marketplace. So we work with a lot of them. But we also work with a lot of growth stage companies who are, coming to America. Maybe they have approval or sales outside of the US and want to come here. And we also work with companies who are based here and have stumbled. So their revenue is underperforming, they're not tracking and they're getting a lot of pressure. They need to get to exit. And so we come in and it's, what can we do to solve this problem? Because usually it's a failure to get positive coverage or reimbursement. And that's something that we do a lot of.
It's interesting that you say that, because I know I've talked to somebody in Europe previously, and they had said, we're interested in moving our headquarters to the United States. We want to be on either the East Coast or the West Coast. And I was like, that's a big decision by itself. So you probably need to make that decision first, and then you could kind of follow along with the others. So,
That's
but
funny.
yeah. So what shifts have you seen in the economic models and strategic direction in healthcare economics?
So there's a lot going on in this space, obviously. Especially with all the shifts from COVID. And I know we're gonna, probably get into that. How could we not? Some of the real practical shifts that I will talk to companies about that we're seeing in terms of health economics. Number one is early requirement from investors. So what we're seeing is investors are requiring more health economics earlier to support the value prop and product pricing and to demonstrate that there is, in fact, a viable reimbursement pathway. Even though with emerging technologies like AI, there's money flowing, overall, there's less money going to early rounds in med tech. And so you've got more companies competing for less dollars. Investors are savvier about this. They're hedging risk more, and they expect to see that there's a defendable economic value story. So we do a lot of pitch decks. We revise pitch decks. We help companies with this. And a lot of what we do is add that component, because it really can't be like your CFO doing a back of the envelope calculation. That's, just not going to cut it anymore. So that's one. I think another one is inclusion of real world data. And I'll even add the adjective local real world data. So a lot of what I talk about is that things are getting very localized in terms of value prop. And this represents a challenge because our market is so diverse. We have such diversity in payers, health systems. And so you've got a lot of people to satisfy and a lot of people with different ideas about what value means. And so overall, though, what we're seeing is, it used to be you did a health economic model and there was this expectation. It was sort of more of the pharma model of populating it with clinical trial data. And now, you'll see even FDA and different agencies, but especially FDA, recognizing the value of real world data. A lot of studies showing that real world studies are as effective at answering certain questions as clinical trials. So populating these health economic models with real world data. And when we say real world data, what we mean is really not collected in a controlled setting like a clinical trial, but in the real world as healthcare is delivered. So it's more reflective of reality. And that is something that we're doing a lot more of. And also designing models so that payers and health systems can populate the inputs with things that reflect their own patient population, because they want to know how this is going to impact their bottom line and their population outcomes, not some theorized base case of just, something else, which I think is really reflective of where everything is going. It's probably a thread that's going to go through our whole conversation today, just in terms of the move to AI and personalized medicine or precision medicine and pharmacogenomics and localized and treating subpopulations and treating the patient in front of us. Everything is getting micro.
Mm,
We've had a very macro, aggregated approach to healthcare over the past 50 years. And it helped us solve some important high level problems, but it's also created a lot of problems.
sure.
And it's that one size fits all. Well, one size does not fit all. And we're finally at the place. And this is where I'll avoid pontificating, but I'm like a geek. I'm a data geek. I'm a geek about healthcare history, and I could get on a tangent. But the third industrial revolution was about data, just
Mm,
producing data, right? And so we had all this data that became valuable, but we didn't really know what to do with it. And the fourth industrial revolution, which we're entering, or some might say we're in, is really about realizing that promise of data. And so that's really exciting. And I won't even go down there, but localized real world data.
so I
And
have a
then the
couple.
last thing, yeah, go ahead. Let me
I was
stop
just
because
going to
I could
say I
just
have a couple of
keep
questions related
going.
to the localized data. So
Yeah.
I know from my experience as well, the moment that you go to, let's just say Asia, right? So now if I wanted to release a companion diagnostic in Japan, they're going to expect, sort of what do the models show that you're going to be able to impact here locally? What data do you already have? Have you studied our population? Do you know what's going to happen?
Yes.
So you guys help to provide a bit of that, outlook as well.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, that's a little bit of where I was going with the data tangent, which is um, we're still a long way off from true interoperability and device companies or people having access to all the different data streams and them coming together to really demonstrate and prove their value prop. So we're very much still in this space of needing, you know, what data even exists and how do I pull it together? That's a big part of what we do. What is it that we need to address? What is it that we need to show? Where can we get that data in a cost effective way? How do we combine it and bring it together in a study or a model or otherwise? So, yeah, absolutely. Because you can't show up with this is the issue in AI too, right? I mean, you can't take this and say it applies to that. That's the old model. That's not where we're going anymore, thankfully. Because I really believe that's one big cause of our low value. I don't believe, I know it's a cause of our low value healthcare in this country.
Yeah.
Is that we're taking models that were developed in clinical trial populations, which are really narrow and really well defined for a particular reason. And we're applying that to all comers, and it doesn't apply. It doesn't work. And our clinical guidelines are based on this. And we have many, many examples of, where this is falling down.
Yeah, I know recently in one of the interviews that I did recently with focused on liquid biopsy, the similar sort of topic came up that, look, I mean, cancer is not, one cancer isn't the same, even throughout its lifetime. So, it shifts over time. So,
Yeah.
the next question from my side would be, so in terms of underserved populations, how are underserved populations even defined right now in the models that you guys provide?
Yeah. So underserved populations are really, from our perspective, and I think the general perspective, vulnerable populations who face barriers to healthcare. So that's underserved, right? They're not getting access to the health coverage and the basic healthcare services that they need. And these are typically members of minority populations or groups who experience health disparities. And I think everyone, it won't be any surprise to anyone. African American, Latino populations, refugees, individuals with disabilities, individuals with low health literacy, or just a general lack of, familiarity with our healthcare system in this country. And I think until you've worked with some of these populations, I had the privilege of doing studies in refugee populations in this country. You don't, it's hard to fully grasp even just how many layers to this there really is. So, there's also just basic social determinants of health stuff, access to transportation and that kind of stuff. So that's how I would define underserved populations.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting because I grew up in Northwest Indiana, and we definitely saw individuals who, had never been to a doctor, very very seldom had been to a doctor, even, and so I could only imagine somebody that doesn't have access just wouldn't show up in a lot of the data
Mm-hmm.
that we have to be able to provide for these sort of things.
Yes. And that's what's really exciting. Really, I mean, I've worked in health equity and health disparities a good bit of my career. It's always been a layer to the work that I do, and what I'm passionate about. And, it's just really exciting to be working in this field in this time because we're really seeing these new technologies come that are addressing these issues. And, we're seeing all of these technologies that allow people to get access in new and different ways, not having to show up, whether it's, at home delivery versus showing up for an injection, or whether it's a remote monitoring technology, those types of things. So it is an exciting time.
Yeah. And so, I mean, whenever you look at data models or you even think about the future with artificial intelligence, how do you envision that we could prevent bias from creeping into those models?
Yeah, so AI, there's a lot to talk about there, and I'll get really excited about this. So let's talk about bias first, since you brought it up. So let's talk about bias. So um, might be good to just do a little primer. I don't know how many people, who watch this or listening are really into AI. Maybe some people are joining for the first time the conversation, but um, when we talk about bias in AI products, from my perspective, we're talking about very established research problems, so old problems, within the context of very new complex products. And those old problems are internal validity and external validity. So when we talk about research, these are the two sources of bias that bias can impact. So, what is internal validity? That is just essentially, are we measuring what we think we are? Is that relationship really causal? Those kinds of questions. Are we adequately controlling for confounding? I'll give an example because that's often easiest. So if you are wanting to include in your model or your algorithm a measure of medical need, and you are utilizing healthcare costs as a surrogate or a measure of need, are you really measuring need? And you could just skim the surface of that and be like, yep, that sounds good. That's a good measure. But truthfully, it's not a good measure. And there's a lot of things that impact healthcare costs. So obviously, minority populations who have access issues are going to have lower costs. Even if they have insurance and don't have access issues, they historically have lower costs. So you will actually be missing some of the people with greatest need by using that surrogate measure, and therefore introducing bias into the algorithm or the model.
Sure.
So that's an example. And then external validity is really, do the results apply in different settings? And so this is the issue of the data in the AI, right? Like the underlying data that the model's been trained on and developed. And so do the results apply in different settings? And the answer is really often no, they don't. So that's sort of the overarching issues. I don't know how much you want to dive into the different kinds of AI products and machine learning and all of that in terms of what's happening in the landscape, but happy to if you want to.
Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to hear your thoughts in terms of where you think things are going
Mhm.
next from an AI perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about some definitional things with AI. So AI products can have different purposes. They can look really different. There's like a big range. So diagnosis, triaging, treatment, predicting outcomes, predicting adverse events, and they can be just an algorithm. They can draw data from an EMR. They can combine genomic data with other types of data. They can use imaging. They can pull data from a biopsy. So there's a lot of different types of AI products, and that means they'll be regulated differently and they'll have different reimbursement pathways. So I think right at the beginning, there's a lot of confusion about the pathways for these products. And then they can have different approaches. So, different uses, they can be rules based or machine learning. So, rules based is just what it says, right? It's based on something established like clinical guidelines or practice guidelines, something in the literature. What we hear a lot about most is machine learning.
Mm.
And without getting into supervised, unsupervised, and all,
Sure.
all of that. Um, I think the most important thing is there's kind of two types of ML algorithms. There's locked and there's adaptive. And locked is just what it says. If patient A comes in with these characteristics and the algorithm says high risk of cancer, if patient B comes in 6 months later with the same characteristics, the algorithm will say high risk of cancer. So same input, same output. That's a locked algorithm. But the one that has everyone most concerned and that there's a lot of activity in the marketplace and especially at FDA about is continuous learning or adaptive algorithms. And so those are the ones that change and iterate as new data comes in. So in that case, patient B comes in 6 months later, they may not be routed to the same outcome or the same decision point. And so we can all pretty easily deduce that there's some concerns and risks and risk management that needs to happen around that, because there can be patient safety issues. And then from a regulatory standpoint, how do you monitor that? How do you, um, you know, resubmit? When do you need to resubmit updates and things like that? But I would say overall, the risks really fall into three buckets, and we kind of touched on them: the data underlying the algorithm, the nature of the algorithm itself, because we as people can introduce cognitive bias into the algorithms, and then how the product, is deployed. So,
Yeah,
and
it's funny because I've spoken to Dusty Majumdar and several others with regards to AI and what their thoughts are around this and this whole idea of you know not having a black box, but having something that exactly what it's doing when it's doing it, so that you can kind of know whether or not if it's doing it in the right way is something that I know has been stressed, overall in our discussions as well. Just that look, turning over a computer and having it just do stuff is probably not wise, but being there and kind
right.
of double checking the results and saying, yeah, I agree, or I agree, but I would make this adjustment along the way, makes a lot of sense to a lot of people as well.
Absolutely. And I think what's a little comforting to me and maybe to other people, is as a data scientist, I mean it's really not different from anything we've been doing before in terms of developing models. I mean,
Right.
we've prior to all of this, an analogous problem that could be solved with AI now is we have a lot of outcomes in healthcare that are not easily studied. They're not well defined. They don't have codes associated with them, but we have to study them nonetheless. And so we've had situations. An example would be anastomotic leaks in like bariatric surgery. So the potential for a leak on the staple line, and then you have risk of sepsis and all kinds of downstream sequelae. And so that's not, how do you define a leak? How do you define a leak in administrative claims data, right? There's no code for leak. Um, and so what we had to do was build algorithms, essentially predictive algorithms in those data sets to predict leak. And then we had to validate them back on a clinical data set and show that they actually predicted leak in an existing data set. So it's the same types of concepts that need to be applied to these products. And I guess I would say at the end of the day, the ways to really prevent bias are kind of straightforward, probably easier said than implemented, but important nonetheless. Have diversity in the data set that the algorithm is trained on.
Right.
It's concerning, right? I mean, I read a study on imaging technologies. It was like a 2020 JAMA study, and I'm forgetting the author's name, but they looked at like 56 studies that underlied imaging algorithms, and 70% of the patient population underlying those studies came from 3 states: California, Massachusetts, and New York. And 34 states of the US were not represented in any of the studies. And so that's concerning.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That's concerning. So I think, diversity, or the flip side of that, and this is something we advise clients anyway, is focus, right? Focus on a very particular population or a particular use case. Don't, at least to start, don't try to be all things to all people everywhere. And if you narrow that way, then you won't get in as much trouble. And then make sure you're using unbiased variables, estimates, definitions, models. I mean, we've worked with various AI companies, and data scientists are not necessarily healthcare people, right? They don't necessarily, right? This is the same thing we ran into in academia, when you're running a data analysis core facility and the clinical researchers come in, and it's like, okay, we need to bridge this gap, right? You need to understand, I get the clinical perspective, but the data perspective is you need to understand what you're measuring. You don't just throw anything into a model, right? There needs to be an understanding of what we're building and what we're doing. So I think, unfortunately, we see a lot of that, just not enough thought put into the measures and how we're measuring things. Yeah.
Yeah, or you could definitely wind up with a model that has inherent bias just due to the fact that the way it was constructed. So yeah, for sure. So to shift gears a little bit, what shifts do you think will happen in the market due to COVID?
So I think overall, what we're seeing is a much, much needed disruption to the inertia that normally characterizes our market. And I think we're going to see an exponential speed historically, or exponential increase compared to historicals in the speed of adoption for these technologies, especially ones that can drive big bottom line changes. And we do a lot of budgetary impact models. That's what health systems want to see. It's what payers want to see. Tell me, and a lot of people don't know this, but a lot of payers, they have bottom line numbers. If you can't move the needle by a certain amount, they're not even interested in looking at your technology. And so I'm excited by this. It's a paradigm shift. But what I'm also excited about is getting to see these budgetary impact models for these emerging tech. I'm seeing bigger impacts than I've seen in a long time. And it makes sense because it's exciting. I mean, all of a sudden you can route people and say, all of these people, can be treated upfront this way and avoid all of these costly hospitalizations down term. All of these people don't need this expensive extra workup over here. And when you start multiplying that by the numbers, when you're talking about diabetes and cancer, I mean, you're seeing big impacts to the bottom line. So I think there's this incredible potential to address the whole quadruple aim of healthcare with these emerging technologies. But there are huge hurdles in the marketplace, huge hurdles. I could do a whole other, episode on market access barriers for, AI and laboratory companies. But
yeah, it seems at least from my perspective, right? I mean, what I'm seeing a lot of investment go to right now. So we've seen a huge amount of investment go to companies like Freenome, where they're working on, personalized diagnostics and next generation sequencing. there are lots of dollars going that way. There are also a lot of dollars for sure going towards the COVID route as well.
Yeah.
But I've seen major slowdowns in, I mean, I was just talking to somebody yesterday about an antimicrobial drug that they're working on. I've had previous conversations with somebody else about an epileptic drug, and those guys are, I mean, they're having a lot of trouble finding money. And it's because a lot of these dollars are being sort of redirected, I would say, to to other things inside of COVID. And are you seeing the same thing on the AI side then as well?
I'm seeing a lot of dollars, seeing a lot of interest and a lot of dollars. I think the what's interesting, we're seeing a lot of overseas dollars coming for those technologies, and I think especially East Asia. And I think what I'm seeing actually is it's almost I don't want to say unfortunate. That's not the right word, but it's allowing companies to make moves before they fully thought things through, and they're stumbling. And I like to remind people there's a 98% failure rate for digital technologies. You can join the bucket if you want. My job is to make sure you don't, but it's an uphill battle. And, there's some imploding happening because they're, jumping the gun. And we're seeing this across the board. I mean, one of the trends that I'm really seeing, I don't know if you're seeing this as well, but we have a lot of new players entering the marketplace. We have a lot of people coming from other health to other tech, direct to consumer, and they're entering this regulated market for the first time. And you've got really, really smart people, but they're either coachable and willing to admit what they don't know,
Right.
or they're not. And what I always say to people is, my job, what we say is, I'm not going to let you do anything stupid, but I can't stop you. So if you want to do something stupid, please go ahead. And I just don't want to be, attached to that.
Would rather not be involved. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. But you've got a lot of smart people. It's sort of the equivalent of the patient walking into the doctor's office and saying, I know what I have, because they've done all their internet research.
Right.
These are really smart people. And they can pull the pieces together, but they don't understand the nuance. And I'll give you an example. I had a company. It was a precision diagnostics company, backed by some of the largest players in this space. Had a lot of possible applications. They were going to go screening for, liver. I think it was liver. And they had this whole go-to-market strategy, which we basically had to which just fell apart like this, because I said, it basically had regulatory approval, FDA, and then just a little short arrow down to CMS reimbursement. And, boom, it's going to happen, which, we all know. But the bigger point was, I said, you do realize that CMS is statutorily unable to pay for a screening technology unless it's a carve out, right? And you don't have a carve out. You're not breast, you're not colon. That's how we got Cologuard, but it's not going to be you. I'm sorry,
Right.
and it was just no, because they hadn't gotten that deep, basically. And they shouldn't. They shouldn't. That's what you have experts for. So,
but
anyway,
it also kind of goes back to, I mean, because so I've done this whole sort of personal analysis of what happened with Theranos, right? As an example, right? I mean, not to say that anybody here is associated with them, but the whole thought that you have somebody that has a good idea. I mean, certainly if you could run, over 200 tests with, just a small sample of blood, it would be a great idea. However, this is where you kind of have to rely on the experts to say, will I ever find enough signal to run 200 tests out of this little tiny amount of blood? And I think, at least the industry experts that I know, they had said, look, it's not possible today. What they were trying to do is not possible at a large scale today. So, how do you move 1 inch closer to that would be a great sort of next step that I could see people taking. But it's this whole idea of not relying on the experts and getting a bunch of people that have opinions, but they're not experts in the field. They just kind of, come in and say, yeah, this sounds like a great idea. And, the investors in Theranos, whenever you look at kind of the overall example, all of their investors, a good majority of their investors, had no clue what they were getting themselves into, and they were just relying on people that really didn't have a strong opinion, and so that relying on the experts becomes critical. Like yourself.
It is so critical, and I think that's a great warning, a cautionary tale, obviously. But I'm telling you, I still see this a lot. And now it's become like a thing with our team. Like I'm getting Theranos vibes, right? This is what they say. We say, to each other, I'm getting because, all of these companies want to go the LDT route because they think it's easier than being regulated by FDA.
Yeah, sure.
And first of all, if FDA wants to regulate you, they will, and they might come in and do it. But there's all this other issue and policy problems with LDTs that these companies don't have a clue what they're stepping into. They think they're going to do rebates. They think they're going to do all these things. They're violating Stark law. They're violating the anti-kickback statute. And you know what? The government is getting nasty and aggressive about this. They're filing civil charges, criminal charges. You can't mess around with CMS and coding and all of this. So it's a hornet's nest, and you should not be trying to navigate it yourself. Yeah. It's an ever-changing landscape.
Yeah, and I personally have seen the positive effects of having a lab developed test initially, and then having that kind of migrate to, hey, look, I want to develop a more personalized diagnostic, or I want to do additional things. But to your point, to try and circumvent something and having that be your market strategy is probably not the right way of doing it. Instead, it's hey, look, let's try and work with individuals that actually could get this thing studied well and used
yes
in a smart way. Yeah.
Right. Because, it's all those downstream implications, and that's where you really have to have the experts. Again, I mean, look, I'm an entrepreneur myself, so I point the finger at myself first, the shiny object syndrome, all of those things, we're all guilty of these things. But the issue is, for example, just continuing with the LDTs, understand the reimbursement pathway. If you're going to go LDT, you've got to establish clinical utility. So if you're going to go to MolDX, or you're going to go somewhere like that, you've got to have clinical utility, or it's a no-go, or you've got to go private payer roadshow. And what they don't understand with the private payer roadshow, my favorite is when it's like, we're going to have this payer, and this payer, and that equals this amount of market share, and we'll put Salesforce around it. And it's like, no, and no. None of those payers are going to open their doors to you. You're not going to get even credentialed. You have nothing to offer them, So there's so much nuance to this, again, that I think if I could just harp on anything, I love to get very far upstream with people and just educate about, the complexity, to your point, and what you do as well, that just the complexity of this pathway, and get this advice up front so you know what you're dealing with, so you know the landscape. Yeah.
And so that you don't, the other thing that I've seen as well, especially in the personalized diagnostic market, is that people get so far afield. Now all of a sudden they're like, well, I've spent all this money, I've done all this research. Now for me to go backwards and do it all over again, to get something else. And it's like, well, that's why at least in my mind, you want to rely, on people that know this journey a little bit better before you get too far afield and then have to spend a lot of money that you've already spent.
Exactly. And, we have both of those stories, and I'm sure you do as well, but just from a study perspective, we've had the situations where, people have listened and it's fueled investment, it's fueled valuation, it's taken them to the next level. And then we have the stories where they come and they're like, I don't want to spend that much. You know, they really have a cost mindset instead of an ROI mindset. And they don't want to spend that much. So they do 3 bad studies and now they're in an even worse spot than they were. And it's like,
Yeah.
help us. And that's where you need the methodology, right? You need the people who can come in and say, look, you need 3 things to hold up your value prop. And you have not brought these specific 3 things together in the same study yet. So once you do, it will work.
Right.
And you know, that kind of thing. So yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, don't have your C-suite write the protocol, please. You
Yeah, and
know?
I mean, the other thing I've seen work out to people's benefit is we're meeting with regulators, you know, when you're ready, meeting with regulators early to get their input before you get, again, way too far. That because they can point out things that they've seen, they know what they're looking for in your data and things like that. I mean, I've seen that benefit people as well in terms of you just
Absolutely.
meeting early and just saying, hey, look, here's what we've got, here's what we're thinking, you know, and kind of going through
Absolutely.
that. Yeah.
We always recommend early engagement with agencies as much as possible. And I think that, but I think this is another area, if you don't mind me just
Sure.
jumping in, because I'm all about, you know, let's call out the barriers and avoid them. Um, you know, it sounds easier than it is. It sounds really simple. And when we run into this sometimes, um, you know, I just had a client. It was in the AI space too. Very complex, a lot of regulatory ambiguity, a lot of reimbursement ambiguity, and we're laying out the landscape, and we're saying, look, you know, the first step is a meeting with FDA. And we need to talk about the pros and cons of doing that in a certain way versus another. And their response is, so your recommendation is a meeting with FDA when we already know it's a 510(k) submission. And I was like, oh, I didn't realize you were an expert in this. But I was like, you know, I didn't say this, but really showcasing your ignorance because number one, you have regulatory ambiguity. We've already checked with agency contacts. We already know you're at risk of being class 3. Or you know, similarly severe, requiring a lot of documentation, whatever you want to talk about. But the other point is, you don't just have a meeting with FDA. This is not just something that
Yeah.
happens. You have to talk about
Right. Yeah.
this, you know, right? Do we do it informally? Do we do it formally? How do we want to do it? And so again, just kind of, there's so much nuance to it, really.
Yeah. Walk in and get yourself in a lot of trouble.
Yes, sir.
So there
Yes,
are 3
sir.
questions that I like to ask every guest. April, what inspires you?
What inspires me? I would say, like, hands down right now, our frontline healthcare workers. I mean, every time I think about what they have gone through and continue to go through, I am just humbled by the selflessness, the call to serve. And I think, how can you not be inspired by this? It's really like the best of humanity. So
Yeah,
kudos to all of them out there.
that's for sure. And I mean, given everything that they've gone through already and, you know, continue to go through, especially in this COVID environment, for sure they're an absolute inspiration. What concerns you?
100%. Policy. I do a lot of policy work, fair amount of policy work, and I'm really concerned about the great need in healthcare and the inability for policy to keep up with the needs and demands of the marketplace. And I mean that at all levels. I mean it at the local, you know, the payer level, the national payer level, the national federal level. I have a lot of opportunity to review different things through my policy work. I'm on the HIMSS Public Policy Committee and other activities and nonprofit activities I do. But like I just not long ago, the Cures 2.0 bill that was introduced in November, just as an example, reviewed and provided some commentary to that. And, you know, there's a lot of goodness in there, right? I mean, the entire point of the bill is to fuel medical innovation, and there's a lot of goodness, but there's also a lot that concerns me. And one of the things that just has stuck with me is we shouldn't have to wait another 6 years for a report on how genetic testing will improve precision medicine and reduce health disparities.
Right.
right? We shouldn't have to wait 6 years to know that information. We already have that information available right now. So it's just, policy needs to change and adapt to meet the needs of of healthcare, and the innovation is there, but we've got this chasm between the innovation culture and the bureaucracy and the inertia of policy and of our market, like more than ever, really.
So it's funny that you said that, because I mean, that's initially where my mind went earlier whenever you were talking about, just some of the things, some of the overall shifts that you've seen in the healthcare market, because I honestly thought coming through COVID and, vaccines getting approved and things like that, I thought it would have spurred some sort of dramatic change that I certainly am not seeing the result of yet, right? So I'm not, we may have gotten to vaccine approval pretty quickly, but at the same time, the key question in the back of my mind is what more could be done kind of across the board along the same line. So yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think we're just at the precipice, right? We're just at the precipice. So we've seen the disruption. We've seen, crisis has a way of showing the cracks and
Right.
putting the pressure on, right? To solve
Yeah.
those cracks. So we see the cracks.
Right.
And we're just beginning. We're just beginning. There's good stuff with telehealth, right? I mean, it's good to see telehealth extended so that, we're seeing some disruption to that, and we've seen some new codes applied. And so there have been some opportunities for new technology to progress. But yeah, I agree with you.
And what excites you?
So in general, change excites me. So, to your point, it's kind of apropos. I think we are seeing it. I think I feel very motivated to try to push that change as much as I can from the top down and from the bottom up. Um, you know, Moving to a new preventative technology enabled rapid learning model of healthcare. It is time. There are things that I have been talking about for 20, 30 years and many others, right?
Yeah.
That are finally getting upended. Are finally we're allowed to question these things. So it's the beginning, and I'm excited for what's to come.
Yeah, it's funny because I was at GE Healthcare decades ago, and decades. The I remember the healthcare CEO at that point in time starting to talk about personalized medicine, and we're starting to really see personalized medicine now. But of course, the way we talked about it was almost like it was around the corner, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and it just takes a while, if it seems like. But at the same time, it's an exciting environment to be a part of, and just kind of help with the transitions overall, in the market,
Yes.
even though it may take us longer than what we'd all hope, right? That it's not today or tomorrow, but it might be decades from now that we actually see these things come to fruition. But it is the work of today that actually puts that in place.
Absolutely. And I think this is where AI and these new technologies are going to help us speed that process up. And so that's exciting, right? Because we have new ways of synthesizing all of this information and making it actionable. So hopefully we shorten that time as we go forward. Yeah.
Absolutely. So if people want to try and get in touch with you, or want to learn more about your company, where could they best do that?
Sure. Obviously, we have a website. It's tti-research.com. We just redid it, so it's a pretty comprehensive resource for different companies at different stages. So I would say there. We're also obviously on LinkedIn, and our emails are on the website. So if anyone you can sign up for our newsletter there or reach out to me that way.
April Zambelli-Weiner, thank you so much for being a guest on the Life Science Success Podcast. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun. Thanks, Dawn.
All right, thanks.